Oh, that sounds...
Okay, hello. So we're going to be talking about identities, carrying on with culture and identity, and a particular focus today on identity and social class. Okay, and the main point of this lecture and the main point of the seminar is this question: is class still an important form of identity? So, you know, how basically we're asking how important is class for people as a form of identity, basically. And during this lecture, I'm going to talk about several things. So it's kind of divided into several sections. First section, I'm going to talk about what is class. So it's a difficult question, to be honest, and it's not a question that has an easy answer. But I'm going to try and discuss what is class. And after talking about that, I'm going to start looking in more detail at a person we're familiar with, Bourdieu, and his idea around habitus, which I think I touched on before, but is related to cultural capital, but is a slight development of it. And once we've looked at that, we're going to look at subcultures and identities of different classes. And what that basically means is I'm going to choose a selection of different classes and kind of look at stereotypes and realities around the culture of those classes. So going from, you know, high class down to working class and also underclass, looking at, you know, the stereotypes of their culture and the realities. And finally, I'm going to end with sort of addressing the question about, not really a question, the declining significance of social class, question mark. Is the social class declining in its significance as a significant form of identity? So that's the format of what I'm talking about today. So first of all, that first question, what is class? Just so you know, by the way, I'm sort of stepping out of me doing a lecture bit at the moment. I'm going to do it quite quickly as well. I'm going to pause a bit, but I'm going to pause less than I used to, because that's what would happen watching a lecture. They're not going to stop for you to write stuff down. But you can always come back to it, just so you know. So, the first question, what is class? And the first person, obviously, we go to is good old Marx. And Marx said that class is a result of the exploitative relationship between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So Marx was very much focused on the fact that with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, the bourgeoisie owning the means of production and the proletariat being subject to those means of production, this created the class system as we know it in Marx's time and, you know, going further into today. And what he said was, the division of labour is what resulted in the division of people into classes. So the fact that labour was divided, you know, that we had separate roles, that you had the bourgeoisie as the factory owners and the proletariat as the workers, this essentially created the class system. And the class system as we know it in industrialised society. And crucially, a class is a group which shares a common relationship to the means of production. So your class is basically denoted by how you fit into the means of production, how you fit into industrial society. Basically, how you earn a living, your occupation, is how we understand class. So essentially that is... Essentially, as I've said to you before... running around. As I've said to you before, Marx is obsessed with the economy. So it's the economy that plays a big part in creating the class system, because This is an economic relationship. Your relationship to the means of production is an economic relationship. It's an economic relationship vis-a-vis the proletariat. You know, the relationship between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat is an economic relationship. Your relationship to the means of production is an economic relationship. So, essentially, class is an economic thing. Okay? So, social class typically is a group of people who share a similar occupation level, income, and ownership of property. Although, as I'm hoping you've recognised before, it is more that in the modern era, or the postmodern era, lots of people said it's more than just economics. It's also, I mean, it is related to economics, but it's also education, lifestyle, taste, housing. So it can be seen as cultural as well as economic. And I have talked about Bourdieu as the person who really sort of came up with that idea of that class is cultural as well as economic. However, I think it's important that we note that the economic difference is really important. And that's actually something I want to note. In a minute I'm going to tell you about that.
Yeah, I totally interested.
Sorry, what I'm going to talk about is basically the categories of social class. So social class as categories. Broadly speaking, it is often said that there are three broad class categories. Working class, those who work in manual jobs. Middle class, professionals or people who work in non-manual positions, in office or elsewhere. And then the upper class, the aristocracy and the owners of industries and corporations. However, I mean, this is a very sort of simplistic view of class, because obviously there are shifts and changes within it. I mean, as an example, in the middle class, people who work in offices in administrative roles. It's been said recently that those kind of very, basic administrative roles are actually a working class. We've had a rise in this country of the service industry. We've got millions of people work in call centres, for example. And those people wouldn't be classed as middle class, although their jobs aren't, manual jobs. They don't necessarily have the same status as being a manager or being, of a higher status. And then there's, a bit of confusion in that these days we kind of think of the owners of industry, the owners of massive corporations, as being the very rich, the very powerful. However, in Marx's day, those owners were the bourgeoisie. They weren't the upper classes, they were the bourgeoisie. The upper classes was the royalty and the lords and ladies. But that's kind of changed. So these kind of categories really shift and change, and it's not really, it's a kind of a basic thing, three categories isn't enough. So what people have tried to do over time is they've tried to more carefully categorize class, still by occupation, but in a more systematic way. So there's been attempts at classification of classes, and it's very complex. I mean, if we accept, as I've said to you, that class isn't only economic, and that all of these class categories are very complex and changeable, then it's very difficult to classify things. So there have been various systems over the years. We could have a whole module on the class specifications and classification systems. I could talk to you about it for ages, but we don't really have that time. But so it is quite complex. But one that is commonly used from the late 90s and first used in the 2001 census, I should say census with an S, was the National Statistics Socio-Economic Classification System, the NSSEC. It was a classification system used to denote the classes. And I'm going to show you an example of this system in a moment. So it's the NSSEC. It's used by the National Statistics Agency. It changed in the late 90s. It was a slightly different system before, and I'm sure it will probably change again. But I'll just show you an example of what it looks like. So I appreciate the words are quite small on here, but I'll just go through what it says. If it's the NSSEC, but I'll just go through what it says. If you want to have a look at this in your own time in more detail, you can. But I just want to talk about. It's got a whole range of occupations. Right at the bottom, you've got never had paid work and long-term unemployed. Then you've got routine occupations, which includes cleaners, labourers, waiters, and so on. Semi-routine, shop assistants, hairdressers, bus drivers. Lower supervisory, craft and related occupations, and that's printers, plumbers, train drivers, butchers. Small employees and own account workers. You've got publicans, pub landlords, farmers, taxi drivers, window cleaners, painters and decorators. Intermediate occupations, you've got things like secretaries, driving instructors, computer operators. Lower managerial and professional occupations, which is actually the highest number. You've got nurses, midwives, actors, musicians, journalists, prison officers, lower ranks of the police and the armed forces. Higher professionals, above that, doctors, lawyers, the clergy, as in the priesthood and vicars, teachers and social workers. And then at the top, company directors, senior company managers, senior civil servants, senior officers in the police and armed forces. So what they've tried to do is they've tried to make a more sort of divided or more precise system of classes by occupation. Don't worry about noting all these down. You can have a look at these in your own time. I think what's interesting is we could sort of broadly organise it into sections. So I think, the upper class is right up here, and then the middle class is sort of it's a range going from. You've got publicans, people who run a pub, farmers. Farmers are often very wealthy, so it's quite all these categories kind of mix and change. It's not as straightforward as this. But I would say upper class, from the professionals down to kind of small employers and so on, that's probably middle class, those four there. And then you've got working class, is the lower supervisory down to the routine occupations, and then you've got an underclass kind of system. But it's a more complex way of looking at it, but it's not without its problems. Okay. So is social class part of your identity? We looked there at occupation. Typically, as I've said, occupation typically is what denotes your social class. How do you know what social class somebody is? Their occupation. So it's traditionally been seen as a central aspect of someone's identity. And it's often one of the first things that people find out about each other. What do you say to someone when you meet them? You say, what do you do? It's a typical question to ask someone, what do you do? So in a sense, it is an important part of identity, just in a simple way. It also impacts other aspects of identity. And this is an interesting thing. This relates to Marx's ideas around the economic basis of social class. And if we take the economic basis of social class as being a fact, And it is something that, you know, we can say that Marx was wrong, he was economically deterministic, he was obsessed with the economy and money, but we also have to acknowledge that in some ways he was right. Because how much money you have affects your life. And it affects in this way, I'm going to show. It's about life chances. Your class, literally how much money you have, what you own, the house you live in, affects your life chances. So your class has a very real influence on life chances. Your life chances are the possibility of gaining what is desirable or avoiding what isn't. So, you know, if life chances might be the possibility of getting a successful job, the possibility of, you know, owning a nice house, the possibility of, you know, having a sort of a happy life, you know, avoiding what isn't desirable. You might have poor life chances. I mean, it is a fact. I'm going to show you a couple of facts here that people of lower social classes are more likely to live. They're more likely to die earlier. People in lower social classes are more likely to die earlier. Essentially, their health is based on their class position. So if we accept that, you know, our class position has an impact on our life chances, then that inevitably has an impact on how we identify ourselves. If your experience of life is difficult, that has an impact on your identity. So, you know, higher social classes have better housing. They have, you know, more access to healthier, better food. They have better incomes, better job security. So purely looking at, you know, the economic facts and the reality of lived life, people of different social classes experience life differently. So that must have an inevitable impact on their identity and how they see themselves. So higher social classes have better housing. And if we go right to the top, in 2012, 10% of the population owned 44% of the UK's wealth. And I think if you think about that, okay, it's only 10% of the population, but you have to think about, I keep on saying to you that identity is not just who you are, it's what you are not. And it's how you see other people that impact your own identity. So if you imagine that people in society, people are, especially these days, people are aware that there's a small amount of very wealthy people who own a lot of the riches, that's going to change your perception of yourself within society. So one fifth of the UK population live in relative poverty. So that's relative poverty is the idea that your poverty is relative to other people. So you might not be as poor as, say, a poor person in a developing country, but relatively speaking, relative to other people, you live in poverty. So it's one of the measurements of poverty is relative poverty, is how poor you are in comparison to other people. So 1/5 of the population of the UK live in relative poverty. Not only that, a man in the upper classes lives on average 7 years longer than someone at the bottom. And this is, in some places, this is very extreme. There is a part of Glasgow where just sort of a couple of streets, one street, the life expectancy is about 82 or 84 or something like that, and then a couple of streets away, the life expectancy is around about 40 or 50. And that's to do with poverty and relative wealth. So inevitably, that must have an impact on how you experience life. And if that has an impact on how you experience life, then I would say it has an impact on your identity. And in a moment, we're going to talk about Bourdieu, and you'll see how what he says has a connection to this. Oh, so this is a good chart that I found about the share of all income received by the richest 1% in Britain. We have from 1918 down to around about the mid-1970s, you had the proportion of income of the richest 1% went down. And then from the 80s, from the late 70s into the 80s and beyond, it went up. So the richest 1% is getting richer in Britain. And if you think about identity being something relative to other people, then this must have a huge impact on how people see themselves in society. I'm going to develop this a little bit later when we talk about upper class. So just leading into what Bourdieu is talking about, I want to talk about objective and subjective aspects of class identity. So the material differences between the classes are the objective differences between them. Objective means, if something is objective, then it is a fact without the influence of opinion. So it is an objective fact that this is a large square room. That's just well, it's more of a rectangle, but that's an objective fact. It is an objective fact that people in lower social classes literally have less money than people in higher social classes. They literally have, less well-paid jobs. They have smaller homes. They're more likely to live, to die at an early age. That is an objective fact. It is a fact, right? What is subjective? So, so they are objective facts. Income, occupation are objective facts. What is subjective are the differences that you perceive, as in personal differences. And this is where identity comes into it. It's not just, there are differences in terms of how you feel, your subjective differences, how you perceive yourself and how you perceive others. And if we accept, as I've just shown, that you have people in the country who have a huge amount of wealth and people who have hardly any wealth at all, then that affects how they subjectively see their identity and how they see other people's identity. So it effectively means that you have a form of class consciousness. It may not be as conscious for some people, although I'm going to present some evidence that says a little bit that says it is. People are aware of their class position. If you accept identity as something you are not, and identity is relative, then the way you see yourself and the way you see others has an impact on your identity and an awareness of your class consciousness. So this leads on to Bourdieu and habitus. Bourdieu's idea of habitus is linked to these subjective differences between classes. Not just the objective factual differences, but the subjective differences. The differences which are based on people's own experience, people's personal and group differences. So he talked about how the subjective aspects of class identity are related to what he called habitus. Habitus is a weird concept, it's quite tricky. I suppose an easy way to think of it is it's similar to habits. It's not just habits and it's perceptions and it's understandings of the world. So I've got a quote here. Habitus is a system of schemes of perception and appreciation or taste. That's one thing that he said about it. And I think what's important here is it's a system of schemes. So it's like understandings of how the world is, which is based on your social class group. So it's how you perceive things and what you appreciate about stuff. I'll make it a bit clearer for you. So habitus is a way in which people from different classes understand and perceive the world. It influences how people react to situations and to circumstances. So your habitus, the way you perceive things, the way you understand life, impacts upon how you react to certain situations, or how you negotiate the world, and how you live in a, really. And for Bourdieu, it's kind of influenced by the economic situation in which people live. So your economic situation and what's tied up in that, also with cultural capital and understandings of culture, changes how you perceive things. So if you think about it, as an example, you could say if people from different social classes react differently to, say, unemployment, for example. If you live in a place with high unemployment, and your experiences of friends and family are unemployed a lot, and you become unemployed, then you are likely, in theory, you are likely to, okay, I'm unemployed again. It may be that you continue being unemployed, or it could be, depending on your circumstances, it might be that you react to that by, really looking for a job and really finding one. So it could be how you react to a set of circumstances is different depending on your class position. And that's economically speaking as well. Seem to have done a double thing. So your habitus. So it's just to be clear, it's a socialized cultural frameworks, norms, and ways of thinking which different classes possess. So it's how you think and how you understand the world is your habitus. Think of it like habits, sort of, mental habits, I suppose. People think and feel and act in a certain way which is defined by their habitus. If you experience life in a certain way, then that means that you will react to circumstances in a certain way. I suppose, another example might be if you were a young boy at school and you failed at school, you may react to that with anger, or you may react to it with acceptance, because you know that your family have all failed at school. You know that failure at school is a thing that is typical of your experience. So your reaction to it is to push away and say, "Oh, school, it's a load of nonsense." Whereas if you came from a middle class background where achievement at education is something which is respected and expected, then your reaction to your circumstances will be different. Your perception of what that situation means will be different depending on your social background, your social class. And it links into cultural capital. I have a slide now on cultural capital, which is something which you should be aware of. So it links to cultural capital, because your cultural capital, if you think about it, do you remember we looked at how cultural capital is linked to economic, social and symbolic capital? You have these resources. If you don't have these resources, or your experience of them is different because of your habitus and because of your surroundings, then that means you're going to react to social situations in a different way. So just a reminder then, I forgot about that. Habitus is not fixed. It can change. People's experiences change your habitus. However, Bourdieu said that it's difficult to effect change. It is difficult to change your habitus. It's the life and ideas into which you are born. It's difficult to change. I wanted to mention just cultural capital briefly. Cultural capital, I've said this to you before, is the knowledge, education, tastes, leisure pursuits, clothes and behaviour, which in Bourdieu's idea is that the wealthy possess. But obviously, as I've said before, it can be used in a different way. So you can have different forms of cultural capital depending on your circumstances. But in Bourdieu's idea, the cultural capital is something that the wealthy or the middle classes have. And you can use this form of capital to exchange for economic and social capital. And it's kind of a direct explanation for why class has an impact on identity. So these two things kind of combined for Bourdieu, this cultural capital and habitus. If cultural capital is your knowledge, your understanding of the world, and your, the kind of lifestyle that you lead, plus your habitus is your perception of the way things are, this, tied together kind of affects how you experience life and how you understand life, how you respond to events, how you respond to your identity and other people's identity as well. So it has a big influence. So the question is I just want to talk about whether or not his ideas are still significant. I've kind of talked a lot about Bourdieu, and we've kind of said, oh, he's great. But actually there have been some criticisms. One criticism is that his work, he's kind of deterministic. He kind of offers a more, detailed, in-depth look at class than Marx did. But he's still kind of saying that our class position he's kind of saying your class position dictates the kind of TV programs you watch, or that somebody from the working classes can't watch and can't get into opera or something like that, and also that it's kind of like your class position determines how you perceive the world, which in a way kind of says that there isn't any way of changing your perception of the world. There isn't any way of getting out of that kind of idea. And that links into... and another thing is he generalises. So he was looking at France in the 80s, and he generalises about class. So he talked about in his work, he talks about lots of sort of French ideas and, French culture, and he sort of uses that to make conclusions about the world. But more importantly, I think, is this: his discussion of the working class is kind of not very convincing, because one of the things he said is that your habitus means that you're less, the way that you perceive the world. When you get some money, you are less likely to make your house look nice, because working class people don't want their house, aren't as interested in making their houses look nice as wealthy people are, which is not, necessarily true. Also, he kind of says that, middle class and wealthy people like opera and things like that, and working class people don't. I mean, that's his view of working class sort of society, or working class culture, is kind of restrictive. Not very convincing. Oh, sorry. So he claims they care less about what their house looks like. However, the reason why we talk about him quite a lot is because his work is really influential. And it's influential because it acknowledges the power of culture in class identity. That culture has a massive part to play. That culture has a massive part to play in class identity. In the way that we see class, in the way that we understand our class. So what we've looked at so far, we've looked at what is social class. I tried to kind of talk about what social class is, looking at Bourdieu and habitus. And now I'm going to look at the different classes, some of the different classes, and sort of subcultural stereotypes and realities of them. So, social class subcultures. People are socialised into their class identities from a young age, and you identify with different aspects of class subculture. I'm going to talk about 4 broad categories, bearing in mind, as I've said earlier, that categories are categories are nonsense. However, we have to use categories sometimes. So I'm going to talk about 4 categories. So I'm going to talk about the upper class, also the middle class, working class, and finally the underclass. So you're going to look at each of those in turn, and looking at, as I said, sort of assumptions and realities of those class divisions. So, starting first of all with the upper class. Ooh, nice transition. So traditionally, from before the Industrial Revolution, and actually at the time of Marx and so on, I mean still to an extent today, but they're less, their number is dwindling and it's become a lot more complex than that. The traditional upper class was the aristocracy. The aristocracy is literally royalty, lords, dukes, ladies, right up there at the top. And actually, I mean, this is arguable because, life is always more complex than, just a simple division is. But, before Industrial Revolution, really what you had was the aristocracy and then everyone else. There was less of obviously that's a completely simplistic way of looking at it, but it was with the Industrial Revolution you had the rise of the bourgeoisie and the middle class and the landowners and the company owners and stuff like that. So many people like Marx have said that changed the class system. So the Industrial Revolution and capitalism encouraged the rise of the owners of industry and commerce. What's interesting here is that, as I've said, this kind of changed in that for Marx it was the bourgeoisie were the middle class, the owners of factories and so on, and then everyone else under them were the proletariat. And I think it's become more complex now, as in you couldn't call a lot of the owners of massive corporations, you couldn't really call them middle class much anymore, especially those that own billions. They're not necessarily, they're not lords and ladies, but they have a ludicrous amount of money. And then you could also include like wealthy sports media stars. But that's where it becomes interesting in terms of that idea that we've mentioned before about cultural capital. A footballer has economic capital, but doesn't necessarily. I don't want to stereotype a footballer, but they don't always have cultural capital. So maybe they have one and not the other. But it's upper class subculture. I think that some of the things we could say about upper class subculture is that they have close relations with people of a similar background. As in, I realised after I wrote that it might sound like close relations. I don't mean that close. I mean that people in the upper classes tend to they go to the same schools, and then in life they live in a kind of bubble, of going to the same places, being with the same people. So their socialisation, secondary socialisation, happens in private boarding schools. Eton, Harrow, Oxford, Cambridge, all this kind of stuff. What's really interesting about these upper classes are, I don't know if you're aware, but many prime ministers of the UK went to Eton and went to Oxford or Cambridge. And the half of the cabinet went to the same school, which, if you think about it, is crazy. So if we say that the government, I've said to you before about how identity can be imposed by the powerful. So if the identity of the powerful is they all went to literally the same school, imagine the power they have to construct identity, not just their own, but other people's identity is huge. So people, in the upper classes have a large amount of high quality cultural and social capital. It's who you know. Literally, you can become the, chancellor because you went to school with the prime minister. That kind of thing. We're talking about social capital or extraordinaire, like the most, at the highest level. And then there are cultural and social events kind of associated with this group, like, going to the races or, high-class events, certain places they might go to, certain things that, royal weddings, that kind of stuff. Oops. I also want to briefly mention, you have this upper class, and then you have, kind of almost on their own, is are the super rich. The super rich have become something which people are much more aware of these days, I think. There's been an increasing focus on the super rich, like billionaires who earn a large proportion of the world's wealth. You know, we've got 1% of the population earn a huge amount of the wealth. And sometimes it's like a mind-boggling amount of money that they have, like billions upon billions that people have. And I mean, it's true that they are small in number, as in there aren't that many of them, but they own a huge amount of wealth. And they're not homogenous, as in they don't necessarily all come from the same background, although a lot of them are white men, as is often the way. A lot of them are white men, but they do show the significant differences between classes. And I use this image because I think it's quite interesting in that, you know, it's a basic image. You've got the very wealthy and then everyone else in that part there. So, okay, there aren't that many people who are super rich. There's a small population of them. But if we think about identity as being something that you are not, something that is relative, something that is based on your perception of your position in society, then surely this situation has an impact on how people see themselves and how people see their position in society. You know, you might say, oh, I don't know what social class I am, I'm not really sure, but you know that you're, you know, completely different to somebody who has a massive super yacht that costs 17 million. That's probably really cheap. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to talk about the middle class. The middle class, then. A large class, possibly the largest. Difficult to differentiate. What I mean by difficult to differentiate is that there are many groups within the middle class. Within the middle class, you could talk about, you know, professionals, managers, lower middle class office workers, creatives, all this kind of. It's a very heterogeneous, the opposite of homogeneous. Heterogeneous. Am I saying that right? Heterogeneous. Anyway, a very varied, differentiated group of people. You know, running from managers, you know, business owners, through to lawyers, doctors, teachers, social workers, somebody working in an office, and, you know, somebody working in an office at lots of different levels. It's a very large, complex kind of grouping. There's great differentiation in terms of culture and identity amongst, you know, those people. It's not actually it's not actually a solid identity in a way. Oops. We still recording? But I mean, we can make some assumptions about them, some commonalities. A commitment to education, a concern with the future, deferred gratification is an interesting concept. Deferred gratification meaning you're putting off pleasure for today for future gains. Working hard now so you can achieve something in the future. You know, it's part of the going to university, for example. Going to university is spending four or so years in education in order to get something better at the end. So you're deferring your gratification for later. It's typically sort of middle class is typically verge towards high culture rather than low or popular culture. Although this is actually changing for a lot of people, as in, you know, there's, I think I mentioned to you before about cultural omnivores, people who are omnivorous in their cultural pursuits, and these people are often from the middle classes, as in they will watch X Factor and then go to the theatre. Go to a Wetherspoons pub on the way to the opera. Maybe not. Well, maybe. oops. As I said, there's great variation within the middle classes. A couple of other things. Lawler looks at Bourdieu's idea of taste and middle class identity. And what Lawler said was that taste is one way in which a middle class secures and maintains its identity by looking down on the taste of the working class, by saying this is our taste, you can't sort of get into this kind of idea of taste and culture. They maintain the boundary of their ideas. So it's kind of related to the idea of cultural capital and other forms of capital, whereby it's a closed system for a lot of people. It's difficult to get into that system by saying these are our cultural pursuits, these are our cultural beliefs. They're kind of policing the boundaries and looking down upon other ideas. Obviously, it's more complex than that, but it's the idea that they won't go to Wetherspoons. Also, they watch. You watch X Factor. Ironically, I don't actually. Some people might say I don't like X Factor. I don't like watching The Only Way Is Essex. I watch it because it's funny, and because it's almost like you're engaging with it, but you're kind of stepping back from it. That's not me. That kind of culture isn't me. I'm something else. So that reinforces your own identity by saying this is something I'm not. So I'm going to talk about working class culture. Traditionally, and I'm going to talk first of all about traditional views of working class culture before moving on to what has changed, because it has changed dramatically. So traditional, it's people who work in manual occupations. Somebody works in a factory, they are working class. It is the proletariat, Marxist proletariat, they are the working class. Traditionally, the perception, I've said traditional culture, this is possibly, I should say, the perceived traditional culture of the working class. What people imagine they were like is that they have a close-knit community. Men work, women live at home. Hard work, central to men's masculinity. I've mentioned there Willis. I don't know if people looked at Paul Willis. We're going to talk about his work when we look at education. But it was one of the options for the Key Perspectives assignment, where he talks about hard work being central to men's masculinity, and traditional ideas that the working class have a strong identity. They have a link to the unions. They have a link to the Labour Party. This is changed quite a lot in recent years, but this is a traditional view of the working class. If you work, commonly you would work in a factory and you would live in the houses. Even far back, it would often be that you literally lived in the houses built by the person who built the factory. Or you lived in an industrial city where you lived in tenement houses or terraced houses where you live next door to the person you worked with. And in these industrial cities, every line of terraced houses would end in a pub. And everyone would go to the pub with the people. They would work in a factory over there, they'd live in this terraced house, and they'd go to the same pub and work with the same people. So you can imagine this kind of close-knit community kind of came about. But then, what happened from the 60s and 70s and so on, is that that kind of solid manufacturing base for the working class started to disappear. It started to, dissipate. So this kind of solid identity of the people you worked with were the people that you lived next to, and the pub that you went to, and it was your whole identity was based around this. That starts to fragment in the 70s, 60s, 70s and beyond. So somebody like Hoggart said that the working class have attitudes of slightly different to the middle class. Immediate gratification, and you spend your money now. You don't invest in university or education to have success in the future. You have immediate gratification. Present time orientation, as in you're focused on what's happening now rather than concerned with the future. And this is deliberately in mirroring what was said about the middle classes. And the middle classes would, you don't just spend your money now, you invest in education, and then in the future you will have success. Whereas the argument is that the working class would be focused on you work now and then you spend your money now. One of the reasons is because of a sense of fatalism. Fatalism meaning you feel like you are fated to live a certain life. Your father worked down the mine, so you're going to work down the mine. He died of emphysema at the age of 40 because he worked down the mine. That's probably around about the age I'm going to die at. But I'm going to have fun because I'm not concerned about the future. I'm going to have fun in the time being, and I'm just going to, keep on going because that's what I'm destined for. I'm not going to do well at education. I'm not going to, this idea. Obviously, we can and we will later on, as we can be sort of critical of this idea in that they're assuming a lot about a large group of people. The idea that you're working class, therefore you don't think about the future, is kind of a problematic idea. We're also going to come back to these ideas when we look at education. One of the key things in education. Okay, so the working class is changing. Changing because of the decline of the manufacturing industries. The working class is kind of fragmented and changed. It's less based on community attachments. Less based on community. If your factory is closed down and you no longer live and work and go to the pub with the people that you work with, then your attachment to community starts to break down. Also, what starts to happen is, your work is not the centre of your life. So being working class implies that your class is based on your work. But what started to happen as industries closed down, as manufacturing moved abroad, in the UK you didn't have this kind of manufacturing work. It became instrumental. You worked to live, not you lived to work. So there came to pass that you had a little sense of class identity. You no longer identify with your class because other things become more important. What kind of things become more important? The things that you own, your home ownership, consumer goods, and so on. One of the things that happened in the 1980s was that Margaret Thatcher's government allowed people who lived in council houses to buy their houses. And it's been said that changed many working class communities, because you had people who were working class. If you had a bit of money, you bought your council house and then you sold it on and moved somewhere else, and it sort of fragmented these working class communities, because not everyone. It used to be that you knew that the person living next door to you was working class, and you had that kind of connection with them. But as people started to sell their houses and move on, it kind of fragmented the working class community. And what started to happen, and I think happens into today, is that people have a home-centred existence. And in fact, when we talk about, later on, we're going to talk about leisure, not today, but another day, we're going to talk about leisure and consumption and how that has an important impact on identity. But, your life is no longer based on, spending time with the people you work with in pubs or in social clubs. Your leisure time is at home. And I think it's interesting, this was said quite a while ago, but nowadays with everyone watching Netflix and, playing on computers and stuff like that, you don't, social life isn't based in the working men's club anymore. So because of these all kind of changes, many say there isn't a solid working class identity anymore. Skeggs, Beverly Skeggs, did a study, and if you might be reading about it in the seminar, She talks about how people have tried to disidentify themselves with their working class identity, have started to see it not as a positive thing, but as a negative thing. He said, no, I'm not working class, I'm middle class. That's not part of my identity anymore. But then, on the other side, many other studies have shown that the continued strength of a working class identity. So there are quite a few studies into this, and some of them we'll be looking at in the seminar, where there's been a kind of quite a large variation in terms of people saying, no, my working class identity is more important to me, or people who are saying it isn't. So, talking about the underclass, how long have I been speaking for?
55 minutes 40.
The underclass. So many have identified the underclass as a new social grouping. You see it in a lot of people. So you've got Murray, Giddens, Gallian, and others have talked about the underclass as a new social grouping. There are differences in how the underclass are seen. Murray is Charles Murray. He's a rare example of a right-wing sociologist. He's a very conservative sociologist. And Murray talks about the underclass as a group who are culturally deficient. They are, that's to say culturally deficient group, as in, the reason why they are the underclass, the reason why they are the long-term unemployed, is because they drink too much. It's because they have a lower intelligence, according to Charles Murray. They have a lower intelligence, they're more likely to drink, they're more likely to be violent, they're more likely to be abusive. But then you've got the opposite end of the scale of sociologists who say that the reason why alcoholism is high in the long-term unemployed is because of their situation. So it's a kind of reversal, if you will. Someone like Murray would say the underclass are where they are because they drink too much, and because they drink too much because of violence and all that. Whereas others would say that violence and alcoholism is a symptom of being in the underclass, not the other way around. It's a stigmatized form of identity. I think I've mentioned stigma before. So chavs is an example of a sort of a derogatory term for people who commonly in the underclass. So I should have made this clear, but the underclass are typically the long-term unemployed, the people who it is said don't work. What's interesting is that the underclass is demonized by the media and by other classes. So I'm going to... So it's kind of labelling people as being, you're in the underclass, you're long-time unemployed, it's because you're lazy and you're drunk. Whereas the other perspective is that the reason why you drink so much is because of your position. So there's been a kind of response to this idea of the underclass by people who are saying things like, the underclass is not a homogeneous rank of the unemployed. It's not like the underclass are this group of unemployed people who are all sitting around doing nothing. They are actually varied and different. There are some who are trying to get work. There are some who aren't. There are some who can't get work because of disability. There are all these different things. It's not homogeneous. It's not just like a rank of people. Most of the unemployed want to work. So this idea that they are somehow culturally deficient, they are somehow a group of people who are that don't believe in work. Research has shown that that's not necessarily true. They don't have a distinct, the underclass is not like a cultural thing. It's not like, they have this distinctive and unique culture that is separate from... I think what it is that people like Murray and others, they kind of see the underclass as being something different. Like they have a completely different way of thinking about the world than the rest of us do. Whereas actually many people who are long-term unemployed want to work. They're not inherently lazy. They don't all have drinking problems because of a lot of them don't. Probably most of them don't. So the question is then, is their identity more ascribed, an ascribed identity which is something which is imposed on you? Or is it something that's achieved? Achieved is something that you choose to have or you work at. So the idea is the underclass is a good example of an identity which is not something that people choose, but something which people believe is imposed on them. And I think that what's interesting about the underclass, and also linked to that, is the working class, is that they are demonised by the media. And I'm going to give an example of this, the demonisation of the working class. There is a book by a guy called Owen Jones. Owen Jones is a left-wing journalist. He looks about 12. He's actually really good if you want to read his stuff. But he wrote this book called Chavs, The Demonisation of the Working Class. And he kind of looked at how the working class have been demonised by the media and society. And their identity has been imposed upon them. You can picture it, the front page of, The Sun or similar, a newspaper, where they have a story about, a typical story is somebody, who has been claiming benefits for disability, and then there's a picture of them, walking down the street or going for a run or something like that. It's like, they're pretending to be disabled. And that kind of, one example is used by the media to paint a picture of everyone within that group. It's called using anecdotal evidence. An anecdote is a story. So what newspapers often do is they use anecdotal evidence. They use a small story to represent their whole people. So you've got a picture of a family, they've got 15 kids and they live in a, £2 million house. Whether or not that's true, that is not typical of all of them. So what happens is that they have a stigmatized identity. They have an identity which is formed by attitudes in the media and attitudes of people. What Jones said was that you cannot, these days, you can't really be racist. It's wrong to be racist. It's wrong to be homophobic. It's wrong to be sexist. But there is no, it is a crime to be sexist, racist, or homophobic. It's literally a crime. Or anti-religious. But it is not a crime to be anti-class. And what Jones was saying is that now it's an accepted form of prejudice. And if we think about prejudice, if you think about your identity as something which is not only yours, but what people impose upon you, then you've got this group of people, the underclass or the working class, who have a certain